All right, guys. The mics seem to be working okay that second time around. Hopefully, it's still working okay. This is 11-9, your political science class. It's Monday 11-9, but I run this stream for both my Monday, Wednesday, and my Tuesday, Thursday class. So regardless, you guys are on the same track. You're just a day off. Take note, please, that there is the test today. It was alluded to last stream, as well as, of course, it's on the Moodle schedule, and we've sent out the message about that as well. Make sure that you're up to date on those journals. Today's journal that would be due today would have been due before class for my Monday, Wednesday class. It's due before class for my Tuesday, Thursday class tomorrow. That is on the Convention of States, the amending of the Constitution. What would you amend? That kind of follows along with Article 5 of the Constitution. So that's where you should be in your journaling. The test is it's test 2B. So there was 2A and now 2B, and it used to be test 2 was just over the whole entirety of the Constitution. And that was a bit much. I mean, it's only 7 articles and they're not long, but you spin into different concepts when you're into the legislative branch, Article 1, and the executive branch, the judicial branch. That's quite a bit of information, obviously, how the government works and how we apply the policy process to those 3 articles, right? So the building, formulating, adopting, and the implementing, all right, and evaluating, those 5 steps of the policy process. That's the first 3 articles of the Constitution. Article 1 is the building, formulating, and adopting. Article 2 is the implementation, and Article 3 is the evaluation, or how the courts evaluate between the two. But then you've got the states, right? So this is the national government, the federal government. You got the states. This is Article 4, things like full faith and credit, the idea of compacts and what the states can do, how new states come into the union. Those are all addressed in Article 4. So the states in this contractual agreement between this national government that's building, formulating, adopting, implementing, evaluating the policy process, and the states that are already doing that under their own constitutions, right? Because they're their own countries for all intents and purposes at this time, separate and sovereign, bound together under the Articles of Confederation, which is that loose agreement that doesn't really have any teeth. The fact that it didn't have teeth is what really pushes those individuals rattled by Shays' Rebellion and the tumult after the American Revolution to saying we need to gain some better control over this system and give the central authority some teeth, the teeth to tax, the teeth to mobilize a military, to quash internal unrest, as well as protect us from external threat. So that's key to that Constitution. But in the Articles of Confederation, each state really has its own sovereignty, much like the United Nations today. If we want to give a modern day example of a confederal or confederacy or confederal system. So the Constitution then is a negotiation to get more power from the states to empower, to give this new entity, the national government, its own standing, right? Not to be subservient to the states, but to be a partner with the states, its own entity. So now we've got 2 parties to the contract. We've got the national party, the national government, so to speak, and then we've got the 13 states, right? 2 parties to this contract. And so how this new national government, how it's going to be empowered, taking those powers from the states, right? And then what the states will retain and what the states have to give up in this relationship, right? And then Article 5 of the Constitution, right? So this is the national government with the policy process. This is the states. Article 5 of the Constitution is, all right, well, what happens if we don't like this relationship? What happens if there's a problem between this relationship? We've created these 2 entities, equal, right, in terms of sharing power, a federal system, a system of shared powers. What happens if we don't like this relationship? What happens if the national government believes it needs to do more? What happens if the states believe that the national government is doing too much? How do we change this contract? That's Article 5. Article 5 gives us the steps, the process for either party to initiate changes to the contract, either through the national government, when 2/3 the House and 2/3 the Senate of our national legislature says, hey, we need a change, that change can then be put before the states, and the states, if 3/4 of the state legislatures agree, or if Congress says we don't want the legislature to decide this, we want ratifying committees, right? Like the Constitution was done not via the state legislatures, but it was ratified via these ratifying committees, these delegations. So Congress gets to choose that, but regardless, whether it's the state legislature or the ratifying committees, if 3/4 of those groups throughout all of the states say, yes, that is a good change, then that becomes a change. Flip side, let's say that the state says, we don't like this relationship that we have now. The states can also initiate a process for amending the Constitution. It's not as focused, at least in how we read that, Article 5. It would be a convention of states, right? States calling themselves together to offer amendments, to change this Constitution, to strengthen it, to change the relationship between the states and the national government. And they would do that through, again, sending delegates, representatives from the states. Doesn't matter how many the state chooses to send, but at the end of the day, each state only has one voice. So first, 2/3 of the state legislature specifically have to say, we want a convention of states. Then Congress calls that convention of states. And then the states send their delegates, no matter how many they send, but each state will have one vote, one voice, right? And so each amendment then that comes before this group, this convention of states, that will be voted on. And if 2/3 of the states in attendance say, you know what, that's a good change to this contract, that's a good change to this relationship, let's put that out there. They'll reject some, they'll allow some. All of what gets passed out of the convention of states through whatever process is adopted by that group of individuals then goes to the 50 states, all states in the union, goes to all of the states, and then you still need 3/4 of the states to agree to the change. So regardless of how the amendments come to the states, 3/4 of the states have to agree to those changes, right? Whether it comes from the legislature, like a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, or a judicial, 10-year put terms on your federal judges amendment to the Constitution. If that comes from the federal legislature to the states, it still takes 3/4 of the states to agree. If the states get together and say, we want to do away with the 17th Amendment, we want state chosen through their legislature, state U.S. senators versus electing them by popular vote. We want to reinforce our presence as a state in the national government. If that's the case, and the state, through the Convention of States, the states decide that and they pass that out, it still has to go to the 3/4 of the states for their agreement, right? Everything goes is ultimately decided by 3/4 of the states, which would be 38 states. 2/3 to get it there in front of the states, but 3/4 of the states, 38 states, to actually amend the Constitution. So that's what happens if we don't care for this relationship between these two parties. There's a process for amending it. There's other language also included in there. And again, this power of the Senate. Remember that the Senate was the branch of equity amongst the states. What we call the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, the plan, the New Jersey plan, and the Virginia plan, and how those were brought together, at least in terms of representation, and how the U.S. Senate would be, filled or seated, and how the U.S. House would be filled or seated, was based upon a couple of different ideals. The ideal from the Virginia plan was it should all be based on population. Governments represent people. The power comes from the people to determine the government. A small cadre of individuals from a small state should not be able to stop a large group of individuals from a larger state from shaping a national government or policy that would be in the benefit of the majority of the people. Boom. House of Representatives, right? The more people your state has, the more say you have in the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives, by the way, that's where it comes to the funding bills, where it's funding the military or taxation, right? Revenue raising bills, they all have to start in the House, right? By the people, because ultimately it's the people that foot the bill for this. The Senate was from the smaller states, like a New Jersey, which we don't really think of as a small state today. But again, if we think about size and populations and how large some of these states could grow, I mean, Virginia at the time didn't really have a cap. It was kind of open-ended. It can continue to get larger and larger. Massachusetts included Maine, right? Before Maine was its own state, you had Massachusetts that was part of Massachusetts. So the size of states and how large they might go could be seen as putting a state like a New Jersey or a Rhode Island, which didn't even show up to the constitutional convention, could put them at a disadvantage. And so rather than give up the equity that they had as a separate sovereign state under the Articles of Confederation, states like New Jersey pushed for, right, the idea of a legislature that ensured that each state still had its own voice, and it was as powerful as the next state over, regardless of the number of people. Well, that becomes the U.S. Senate. And so when we get to Article 5, not only do we amend have language about amending the Constitution, it also has language about not denying a senator their suffrage without their approval. I don't know who would approve to that, but without their approval, denying them their suffrage, their right to vote in the Senate. And so that all becomes kind of an issue when we get to the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment to the Constitution, how those U.S. senators come to be, and whether we're following the idea of a Republican form of government. Also, something in the latter of the articles of the Constitution, Article 4, gets us into that Republican form of government. Which is basically a Republican form of government. It's one where you choose the people to represent you from your district. Nobody else chooses those individuals for you. You're not denied the ability to choose the individuals you want. The Republican form of government will be defended. Now, there's a bit of a problem with that, right? The Civil War gives us a situation where after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the North comes in and says, okay, we're going to set up these provisional governments. Well, where does the authority come to set up provisional governments? If the Constitution was intact and you couldn't leave the Constitution, as the South tried to do, and make it null and void, then where does the power and authority come from this national government? Where do we negotiate that the national government would be able to thwart the idea of a Republican form of government and replace duly elected governments in these southern states with new provisional governments? At any rate, we'll have a conversation about that a little bit later on in lecture, a couple of days out as we get into the Bill of Rights and we talk about the different amendments. So the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment deals with changing the Constitution, protecting the right to vote, the right of the senators' right to vote, the equity of the states. And then once we agree on all of that, and this would make sense in a contract, once we agree on all of that, then Article 6 of the Constitution is the acknowledgement that this contract supersedes all other contracts. And anything that's born out of this contract, this new relationship with the central government and the states, that will take precedent, and that the states will adhere to, all entities will adhere to these constitutional rules that come out of this national government, right? Whatever those might be, that we will abide by this contract. And so the Supremacy Clause creates this language, if you will, contractual language, that this document supersedes all other. And it includes the oath of affirmation. It includes no litmus test, no religious litmus test, but an agreement that this Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. And then lastly, the last step in this constitutional process is creating this contract, this building this relationship between this new entity, the national government, and the existing entities, these separate sovereign states. That's how do we make this come to be? And the agreement is that if 9 of the 13 states, only 12 in attendance, but if 9 agree that this contract should be ratified, then it will become the law of the land. Based on the language, how language is written, one would assume that that would only apply to those 9 states, that the other states still remaining would have their own compact or have their own process or still hold true to the ideals of the Articles of Confederation. A little bold to have this ratification of a constitution where the Articles of Confederation are already in place. And under the Articles of Confederation, you have to have unanimous support for changes. So all 13 states would have to agree to these changes or changes in general. So we're not going to call this an extension of the Articles of Confederation. We're going to call this something new. This is a federal constitution, one that creates this federal government, this national government, gives it its own teeth and standing. And so it's really not the Articles of Confederation, even though much of the Articles of Confederation are folded into this Constitution. We can't call it that, because if we want to call it that and we're simply changing the Articles of Confederation, that's going to take all 13 states to agree. And all 13 states are not there. So that creates a bit of tumult, concern, consternation. Use some good words there for you, but consternation, some hard feelings. The individuals of Rhode Island, tiny little Rhode Island, they're not there to negotiate. They don't want to be a part of this, and they're not adopting the Constitution. And for a couple of years, even after Washington has taken office, Rhode Island is still not attached to this national government. And that creates a bit of a problem, right? So you've got this kind of free, separate, sovereign state on the coast and in the middle of other states that are part of this union, and there's questions as to how to deal with that. What should we do about that? No matter. Eventually, Rhode Island too adopts the Constitution as their own, and then all 13 states are players, part of it. And then as new states come into the union, one of the things how states come into the union is interesting. That their Congress develops the Constitution also includes what I call the 20 years rule. The Constitution's it's 88, 87, 88. Its ratification's up and going. So the language in the Constitution says until 1908, so 20 years later, that Congress shall neither strengthen nor weaken really slavery. All right, the different articles in the Constitution, the sections in the Constitution include issues regarding the importation of persons for the purpose of labor, of slavery, and that importation of persons, that language, because slavery was a big deal. It was an issue. It was an issue at the founding of our country. It was an issue before that. It was an issue that ultimately led up to the U.S. Civil War, right? The Civil War between the states. And so recognizing that issue and realizing that in order for this negotiated contract to work and to not lose different states in this relationship, then the 20 years rule was put in that would neither strengthen the institution of slavery or weaken the institution of slavery, right? That was the idea behind the 20 years rule. And right, 1808, boom, right on cue. What does the federal government do? They outlaw the importation of persons for the purpose of slavery, right? They have the ability to do, and if you're not familiar with the movie or read the book or know the history of the Amistad, you'll see that that's wrapped up in that process of trying to end the slave trade while other parties are trying to keep the slave trade going. So that is also in those remaining articles of the Constitution. So the issue of slavery, the 20 years rule, the ratification of the Constitution, getting all states to ratify it, negotiating a document that could get the states to ratify it. And then as new states came on, they would come in under this Constitution. They would, as a condition of becoming a statehood, they would agree to be a part of the federal system, adopting this the U.S. Constitution as their own, and swearing by it, and then they become a state, a member of the United States. And again, to keep that balance, because the issue of slavery was such a hot issue, to keep that balance, as states came in, they'd come in by twos, right? In the North, they'd come in as a free state, and then in the South, they could come in as a slave state. And that was to keep the balance, right? To keep the balance between the free states and the slave states, to ensure that the Civil War could be staved off for as long as possible, basically. It was compromise after compromise. And you can sort of almost see the line, right, between the North and the South as states came in. Michigan comes in 1837. Our state that we're paired up with is Arkansas. So Arkansas comes in as a slave state. Michigan comes in as a free state. And so the states come in keeping that balance because, again, amending the Constitution, right? 3/4 of the states necessary to amend the Constitution. How do you get to that 3/4 if states are coming in and are basically even in the number of states pro and anti-slavery? It really is this, what we call the Kansas-Nebraska Act, an act of Congress passed in terms of how states come in. Congress has that authority, right, under the Constitution to determine how states come in. And so Congress determines that Kansas and Nebraska, rather than pair them up, one free, one slave, as those states come in, their legislature, the federal legislature, has deemed it to be left up to Kansas and Nebraska to decide. And that, of course, threatens to disrupt this relationship of free states to slave states and get us closer, one way or the other, depending on how those states go, to either moving towards a constitutional amendment to enshrine slavery in the Constitution or a constitutional amendment to outlaw slavery in the Constitution. Depends on those, as these new states are going to start coming in. And that creates a lot of concern. In fact, so much so, the Republican Party is born over in Jackson, Michigan. And I know I've already said this, and I said this to you when we were in class together, but there is consistency in the truth that Jackson was born in Jackson, or excuse me, the Republican Party was born in Jackson, Michigan. The idea that we needed a new party or a party to challenge the Democrat Party or an anti-slavery party or a party that would take on, right, when we talked about political patronage, that was great conversation. But the actual act of creating a party takes more than conversation. It takes a platform. It takes planks. It takes candidates. It takes a plan. And that all happened over in Jackson, Michigan, July 6th, 1854. Other areas, Ripon, Wisconsin, Exeter, New Hampshire, Crawfordsville, Iowa, all had groups of individuals talking about the need to create a new party. Great. They're all talking about it. It's over in Jackson. That's where it takes place. That's where it happens. And so that's why we're going to call Jackson the birthplace of the Republican Party. The party is ultimately born because of this Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was going to change how states came into the Union and to disrupt that balance of free to slave states, making the possibility that a constitutional amendment, either from the pro-slave states or the anti-slave states, that would be pushed and enshrined into this contract and seen as a threat to the economic viability of the South or to the moral constructs of man, at least via the North. And it wasn't obviously as cut and dry as that. They're good individuals, anti-slave advocates who are in the South. The problem is the government fully supported slavery in the South, and so to speak out against slavery was to incite, right? To speak out against the government and to incite. And even though we have Amendment number 1, the freedom of speech, you still would have local laws, right? Because the Bill of Rights only applied to the national government. So you would have local laws, local state constitutions, which may not afford you the same rights to freely speak your mind out against the government or on the issue of slavery. And so as such, right, you could be anti-slavery, but you yourself would have to do it under the cloak of darkness and in hushed tones behind closed doors. And you could be supportive of slavery in the North. And it was actually even much more easier to be supportive of slavery in the North than it was to be anti-slavery in the South, regardless. So that takes us through the full Constitution. I just had a great conversation with a student, came in, popped in. You guys are always welcome to pop in anywhere from 10:30 to 11:30. I'm still holding office hours. So if you have anything that you want to come talk to me about, you're more than welcome to come and talk to me. Little heads up is nice. You want to fire me an email and just say, hey, Mr. Williams, I'm going to be there because I work during office hours as well. I'm looking over emails and whatnot and answering students' questions that way as well. So, but you're welcome to come in and sit down. Having that conversation with the student, we had we kind of discussed the principles of the test, and it's going to be primarily on Articles 4, 5, 6, and 7, the latter part of the Constitution. There's some review sprinkled in there for continuity, but for the most part, it's focused on the latter part of the Constitution. But I just wanted to remind the student that this isn't a class in constitutional law. This isn't a class in current interpretations of the Constitution based upon court case and precedent. If you choose to go on in political science and make that your major or into law, then there'll be plenty of time for that. This course is really set up to give you an understanding of how your government works, how the legislative, executive, and judicial branch works, the constitutional underpinnings of how it works and why it's constrained to those processes, and the idea of a written enumerated document that both limits the Constitution, limits the federal government, national government, state governments, but also empowers those entities to do those things within the Constitution, and how where your power comes from as you interact with one another and your government with that document in mind. As we said at the very beginning of class, right? 3 places to be. You could be in the driver's seat, you can be in the passenger seat, or you can be in the trunk. And the goal of this class is to at least get you in the passenger seat. If not, at least get you in the passenger seat, but maybe even instill within you this interest in being in the driver's seat. In other words, being a part of the government. Get your hands on the process, becoming a part of the legislature or the executive branch or the judicial branch. To be in that driver's seat position. The passenger seat is the guider seat, right? That's the navigation seat. That's the individual who gives you the directions where to go. The driving seat, though, you're the individual ultimately making the final decision. And that's where our legislators are. That's where our executive is. That's where our courts are. And so see yourself in the driver's seat because it's your birthright. This is every individual has not only do they have the right, the system is actually set up for it. That individual, that there's not a ruling class, that there's not a blood class, that you don't have to be anointed by God to be the divine ruler. It's not how it works. Our system was set up that citizens would take turns, ultimately representing the interests of their fellow community members and in making government work for their community. And then after their turn was up, go back and live among their fellow community members and pass that baton on to somebody else. And that system was designed, our system was designed for that. Courts are a little different. You do want some continuity and some length in the courts, but putting judges on the bench for life, okay, right? But that does go to show the politics, right? We want an entity that has this long history of understanding when it comes to the relationship and what the laws are and how they should be applied. But as far as the executive goes, over top of the bureaucracy, right? We have a bureaucracy that's put there by merit now versus simply appointed through patronage. But the top level of the executive branch, they're all still there through a selection and election process. Right? Again, should be citizens, should be individuals who have an interest first and foremost about what is good for the community, the people, the country, their state, and that those individuals are in for a short term and they pass the baton. In fact, we have term limits at the national level and state level in Michigan to ensure that the baton gets passed. We don't have term limits in Congress. That might be a convention of the states issue, right? Because I don't see Congress necessarily saying, hey, well, we've been in here too long. How about we put before the states that we should only be here for 6 years or something like that? It could happen. wasn't so long ago that there was what was called the contract with America, the contract for America, where the Republican delegation under Newt Gingrich at the time was in the minority. So the Democrats controlled the majority of the House of Representatives. And so they ran on this pledge that if elected, they would do certain things, right? They would have a balanced budget amendment. They would have a term limits imposed. They would allow for a line item veto. And lo and behold, the Republicans, after some 50 years of being in the minority, they actually win the majority in the 1990s. I think it was 94. And in winning the majority, now they've got this promise that they actually have to fulfill, and they do. And you're going to say, well, wait a minute, they did not. There's no term limits. There's no balanced budget amendment. There's no line item veto. Well, Congress put those things forth, and certain things happened, right? They didn't have enough votes, right? Because it takes 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to propose these amendments, put them before the states. They couldn't get to the 2/3. When it came to term limits, the Supreme Court came in and said, no, that's unconstitutional to limit the terms of individuals. You need a constitutional amendment to do that. So they didn't have the votes, again, the 2/3 votes there to amend the Constitution to impose term limits. And then the same thing was true with the line item veto. Something got struck out. We gave that power to President Clinton at the time. So the Republicans gave the line item veto power to the Democrat president, President Clinton, and he used it. And he struck something out of the budget process that affected, I believe it was New York City, maybe it's the state of New York, but New York City, and they sued. They said, wait a second, you can't just take our stuff away. You got to take everybody's stuff away. And the Supreme Court agreed with that as well. They said that you can't just have this line item veto. You got to swallow it whole, and so even though those principles were put forward, none of them came to fruition. So at any rate, I'm going to give you guys, I sent out an email just to remind individuals, get that test completed. So everybody knows that the test is coming up. On top of that, remember, you can utilize all your resources at your fingertips. You can reach out to fellow students. You can take the test together, 6 feet apart with your masks on, of course. But you can approach this test however you want to approach the test. This is really about me making sure that you know where to get the information, know in the Constitution where this information is, are aware that this information exists. We'll get to the final exam and I'll really test your ability to apply this information. But these primary tests are really about making sure that you acknowledge, understand, know where these different things are. Because again, this goes not just to this class, but to your whole life. This Constitution doesn't stop the day you graduate from Kellogg Community College or walk out of this class, successful or not. It's going to affect you for the rest of your life. And so this is a foundational class, a predecessor if you choose to go deep into the political science as a major or into law, where the foundation of law and our relationship to government, this found here. And so knowing the different pieces, knowing where they are, knowing how they fit, that's the objective of the class. Current interpretations, getting into the minutia of parsing words that are in the Constitution, leave that for 300 level, 400 level classes, graduate studies, whatever. So utilize the website, the lecture notes. Hopefully you're watching these videos, reviewing these videos, but also reach out to fellow students and work on these things together, having a good conversation about these things. Nothing wrong with that. And again, send out an email about its due date, so make sure you're on top of it. Lastly, okay, so a little bit about the election. So where are we on the election? Well, as the conversation spun out with the student who stopped into class into my office during office hours, we're all going to get a very good education into Article 2 of the Constitution coming up here. And that is how electors are awarded. and who determines the processes and procedures for awarding electors. And we could take it out broader and say it's about elections in general, and that's really the realm of the legislative branch. But that language isn't in the Constitution as closely enumerated, right? It's implied. Implied depends on who's doing the implying, but the enumeration that your state legislature and only your state legislature has the U.S. constitutional authority to determine how electors will be awarded when it comes to their state. An equal number to their federal representation. So Michigan, for example, has 2 U.S. senators, 14 House members. That's 16 federal legislators. Boom, that's 16 then electors that will be awarded, right, the power to determine who the president is. Now, in our system, how we developed it in Michigan, really where it is across the United States, except for some tweaks in Maine and Nebraska, is that whoever wins the election by the popular vote will then be awarded the electors from their party to actually then cast the vote for that president. So we don't elect the president. You and I have not elected the president. We're choosing the electors. Well, here's the rub. If a legislature says all votes need to be cast on Tuesday election day and need to be in hand by 8 o'clock, that is a procedure that the state legislature has determined in that process of awarding electoral votes. If the governor of a state or the court of a state comes back and says, well, we have this pandemic going on, so we're going to extend that a couple of days, or we're going to allow for X. That's going to be a question that needs to be answered. I don't know how it'll go, but that's going to be the question, particularly when it comes to Pennsylvania, that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have to decide on. Was the state legislature clear in the processes for appointing electors? What is that process? It's a vote of the people. What are the conditions of that? Votes have to be in by a certain day. If that's been changed against the will or without the support of the state legislature, those votes are going to be in question. This is where we're getting into the all legal votes need to be counted, all votes need to be counted. There's no doubt that there are votes there. The question is, are they legal in the construct of the Constitution? And that's going to be the debate. Article 2, right? Comes back to this Constitution. Who's going to be the president of the United States? Now, that's just Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes. Joe Biden, candidate Biden, has been called by the press, right, that he has won Pennsylvania, right? He's got the votes to win Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, the press doesn't get to determine who the president of the United States is. The process gets to determine who the president of the United States is, including how the electors are chosen and then choose to vote. That still needs to take place, and that'll take place sometime mid-December, I think December 16th, but sometime mid-December, where your electoral college will actually cast the votes for president. And how they're appointed matters. In the state of Georgia, you've got an election that's so razor thin, it looks like it's going to be maybe 4,000 votes separating the two, maybe less than that, out of millions of votes cast. And the same is true over in Arizona and Nevada, for that matter, where Nevada's a little bit wider, but I think as the votes finally get tallied, it's going to tighten up. And the same is true for Arizona. Fox News and AP called that race way too early. It is tightening up, and it may look like former Vice President Biden is going to hold on, but again, a razor thin number of votes. So to ensure that the candidate who wins the popular vote actually wins the popular vote, you can bet there's going to be recounts. And any vote that shouldn't have been voted, right? Somebody who was dead and voted, somebody who didn't have the proper paperwork in place, the residency requirements, any of those things, that's what's going to be challenged. In fact, the reason you have poll watchers and poll challengers is to ensure that, particularly when it comes to absentee ballots, that if any of those things are not in place, any of the lawful things that the legislature put in place are not in place, you can challenge those ballots and review them later. If you remove the poll watchers and the challengers, then you lose the opportunity to determine whether or not those ballots were valid or not valid. That's going to be a big issue as well. But there's going to be recounts. And until you have the recounts and truly know what the popular vote is, you can't award the electors to cast the votes come December. So is the election over? No, it's not over. Is it close to being over? Yeah. Things really have to line up for President Trump to retain his presidency, to get the 4 more years, to be reelected via the Electoral College. But there's true questions there, and there are the steps of a recall, and you'll be too young to remember this. Many of you will. Some of you may be old enough. I don't know, but in 2000, 20 years ago, right? So maybe before some of you were born. Many of you were born, but in 2000. Talk to your parents about this. If you have older siblings, talk to them about this. But in 2000, we had an election that came down to Florida. And it was the 270 state. You either got 270 with Florida or you didn't get 270 with Florida. So it all came down to Florida. And in Florida, President Bush, who was Governor Bush at the time running for office, against former Vice President Al Gore, who actually was vice president at the time, but he was running for president. And it came down to those two individuals. Well, going in originally, the media called Florida for Al Gore. Oh, this is Al Gore's. And as the election tightened towards the end, George Bush went up 11,000 votes. He was up some 11,000 votes. But at the end, it was tighter than 11,000 votes, and Al Gore called for a recount. Now, not to get into the weeds, but there was some, right, picking the different jurisdictions you wanted recounted because those would be the ones that were most likely to give you the votes that you wanted. And the legislature objected to that. The courts were brought into that. And eventually the Supreme Court said, look, you got to count all the votes or you can't count any of the votes. You can't disenfranchise some individuals and to ensure that other individuals' votes count. And so that ultimately ended the counting. But in that process, we went from what was an 11,000 vote spread down to a 700 vote spread in the state of Florida through recounting. So if we're razor thin, 4,000, 5,000 votes, yeah, the change could give former Vice President Joe Biden a greater majority of votes, the popular vote, or it actually may winnow his votes away and give current President Donald Trump the victory. We don't know yet. So it's disingenuous of this media at best, planned at worst, for them to come out and to actually call this election, knowing that 20 years ago, it was 37 days of counting and discernment and court wrangling before we actually had a president chosen. The difference being, of course, is we didn't have a sitting president running. So to deem either one of those individuals as president didn't have a political impact. This one certainly does. It has a political impact to try to begin to move towards this idea of acceptance that Joe Biden is the president, which he may well be the president-elect. But to not acknowledge the fact that there's clearly a potential path for President Trump to retain his presidency, which is not so far out there. All right, guys. So that's where the election is today. Some wild conspiracies out there. If you've been watching, particularly here in Michigan, we had a race over there in was it Rochester Hills, was that? I'm trying to think about. Well, it was on the east side of the state, and there was an error in the vote tally, and a candidate who was totally lost by 100 votes came back and won by 1,000 votes after they fixed the vote tally. Up there in Atrium County, up north in the before the bridge, there was a glitch, bing, bing, a glitch that had awarded a number of Trump votes to Biden. That was then hand counted, and the votes were then properly returned back to President Trump. That was about 6,000 votes in a pretty small county. There were other glitches that happened throughout the United States that call into question, again, the validity in those tight elections. And we need to take a look. The name of the company is Dominion. And, like I said, there's some wild conspiracies out there. I'll let you do your own searches and take a look at that stuff. At the end of the day, we need to have confidence that the election was both run and materialized and finalized properly. And if we don't have that confidence, we're going to get another 4 years of what we just had. But rather than President Trump, well, it doesn't matter. President Trump or a new President Biden will not have the support of about 1/2 of the population. And the last 4 years were chaotic. And I assume that the next 4 years are going to be equally chaotic. So lastly, all eyes are on Georgia. Georgia was so tight because of those votes and some of those anomalies that what were 2 U.S. senators elected, one in a special election, the other in a typical U.S. election for Senate. Both of them being neither candidate, the Democrat or the Republican candidates, getting the full vote, a full majority of votes. And so in Georgia, they have a process where you go into a runoff, where the 2 top candidates will go into a runoff. I actually like that process. I think that that's a better way to ensure that the state is voting for the candidate they want for their representation. It's a little bit like popular choice, where you kind of pick your candidates and then the 2 drop off, and you're allowed to vote until you get to the 2 candidates at the top that will best represent the state, and you choose between them. At any rate, so the control of the U.S. Senate is going to come down to Georgia, and that's a big deal. So watch that as well. All right, guys, if anybody has any questions for me, please don't hesitate to email me, williamsj@kellogg.edu. Stay on top of the Moodle class. Stay on top of those journals. We're at week 6. That was the one that's due today, right? So we assign them over the weekend. They're due today. Next week, Monday, Tuesday, will be, right, Journal 7. Okay? Questions? I'll see you.